Welcome to New Breakpoint, Microsoft's digital event series designed for developers by developers. We broadcast on the second Thursday of every month, and if you join us, you can ask questions that my guests will answer during the show. And you can watch all of our previous episodes on demand on YouTube. I am your host, Michelle Sandford, Microsoft's Developer Engagement Lead for Australia, New Zealand and Asia. And today we welcome Melissa Houghton, who is a Microsoft MVP as well as the Principal Software Engineer for MakerX, which is a research and development studio. Hey Melissa, thanks for joining us. You've been awarded MVP status for the past 4 years. I think maybe not everyone watching the show knows what that is. Could you tell us a little bit about what it is?
Yeah, hi Michelle, I'm happy to be here. So a Microsoft MVP is a recognition that Microsoft provides to people in the community who are doing knowledge sharing and helping others learn how to work with different types of technical tools, and specifically ones that have to do with obviously the Microsoft community. So working with Azure, and I do a lot of .NET development and application development. I love speaking at conferences and helping to organize community events. So Microsoft has given me this recognition to sort of thank me, I guess, for all the stuff that I've done, but also to help me share that knowledge with a wider range of people. And it means that I have a wider network in which I can continue to help people learn.
It's super competitive to become an MVP, right? You don't not just, get that renewed every year as a rubber stamp, right? You have to keep working at it.
Yeah, that's right. And I was actually involved in the community for a number of years before I was rewarded the MVP status. So it's not something that, you can just get out of the blue. It really does take that passion and that hard work. And it's something that I personally really enjoy and I love. So I do it for the love and the passion of it. And I think that's what really makes the best MVPs. It's the people who do it just because, not because they're specifically trying to get that MVP recognition. We do it because we want to give back to the community and we enjoy helping other people learn and expand their technical skill set.
So we are super pleased to have you on the show today, and you're going to show us the ins and outs of Bicep with some demos. I'll remind our audience that you can all drop questions into chat at any time and we will answer them as we go. And we will also stick around at the end of the episode for about 10 or 15 minutes to answer any questions that we don't get to. So this episode is all about Bicep, and it's very timely that we're talking about it because we're seeing more and more infrastructure as code stuff becoming the responsibility of developers, which means we no longer have to wait for other teams to stand up environments for us and to get stuff ready, but it also means that the buck stops with us and we need to get it right. So it's clear that tools like Bicep are becoming such a necessity to have in our toolkits. But maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Melissa, could you tell us a little bit about what Bicep is?
Yeah, so Bicep is a way to declare your Azure resources. So you have your Azure Resource Manager, and you might have heard of ARM templates in the past. So Bicep is a new addition in the last few years to make it easier to declare those Azure resources. So it's a declarative syntax language which allows you to talk about the future state of what you want deployed into your Azure resources and deploy those in a repeatable, easy to work with, very configurable way.
So I wasn't sure. I was speaking to the team about it yesterday, and I said that I wasn't sure whether Bicep was better than ARM or not, and whether we should be saying people should use Bicep instead of ARM. But I asked one of my colleagues, Ben, and he said, oh, it definitely is. What do you think?
Yeah, so Bicep is written to be more developer friendly, and it's basically a step above ARM, and Bicep actually transpiles down into ARM. So behind the scenes, it's still using the ARM templates. But if you've worked with ARM in the past, it's written in adjacent syntax that you're trying to kind of configure that didn't quite work as a developer experience, it was a bit difficult and there was a lot of errors and things that were getting a bit confusing. So Bicep was created to have a better developer experience. It added some type safety and more clear syntax. It abstracted away a lot of the nonsense that developers were kind of getting lost in as they were trying to declare the resources. So I would definitely say Bicep is a lot easier to work with, and they're trying to simplify it as much as possible and set up tools for you to be able to declare your resources. So you can, on my screen, I have just the documentation around Bicep here, and they're talking about some of the benefits that I just mentioned. So there's different resource types and API version, but really for me, I think it's around the syntax. So if you look at the syntax, this example here is very basic Bicep syntax. You declare a resource, you pass in the different properties and things that you might need. This example is a storage account. You can have parameters. You can compare that to the equivalent JSON template, which is what we were working with before Bicep arrived. And there's a whole lot more information that you have to do here. When you're passing in parameters, it's not verifying the way that you're setting things up, whereas now there's tools to be able to work with it more clearly and able to have a much nicer experience as a developer. And we'll look at how this works in person, but they also have an example here of using the Bicep extension within Visual Studio Code, which helps with some of that IntelliSense and autocomplete and making sure that you're following the right structure and everything within your Bicep, which we struggled to get that when you're working straight with ARM templates in itself.
Oh, cool. So what we're looking at here is the Microsoft Docs, right? So they can check this out afterwards and go through it at a slower pace.
Yep. Yeah. So if you just go to the Microsoft Bicep documentation, they have this page that's just what is Bicep. So you can read through that a bit more to get more information on what Bicep actually is. But the important thing is it's really declarative syntax to be able to deploy your Azure resources.
And just for Azure then?
Yes, so that's one thing. People sometimes wonder why you might not use Bicep. We're talking about how much better it is than ARM. And really, for me, my point of view, the only time you would not want to use Bicep is if you're deploying to other clouds. So it only works for Azure because it transpiles into the Azure Resource Manager templates, and it's specifically for Azure. So if you're going to AWS or Google Cloud or anything else, Bicep is not going to work in those cases. But if you're working on Azure, Bicep is definitely the way you want to go for your infrastructure as code.
Awesome.
So what I wanted to show you today was first talking a little bit more about Bicep. But Bicep has been around for a few years, so there's tons of resources around there. The hot topic of the day, as we know, is AI. So I wanted to talk specifically about using Bicep to automate setting up your AI services within Azure. It's something that I've been working on recently, and as more people are setting up generative AI and incorporating AI into their business, it's really important to understand how to do that in a repeatable way using infrastructure as code, and in this case, Bicep. So I have taken a public Azure sample that I will be taking you through today. So if you go to GitHub and you go to Azure samples, there's a whole bunch on there, but this one is an OpenAI app quick start. And the reason why I chose this is because they have set up all the infrastructure as code in Bicep. So what's in this application, we'll share the link that you can dig into this yourself and set it up yourself as well. But the features that are in there is a Python application that's a little AI chatbot, so you can ask it questions. It's kind of like your own little chat GPT type of thing. It has basic streaming responses, so it can only do chat at this stage. There's no support for image generation or anything like that, so it's just pretty basic. But the main thing that I'm going to show you about is the Bicep files. And the Bicep files are there to provision all of your Azure resources. And this is the architecture diagram for the resources it provisions. So the app will be hosted as a Azure container app, which is a serverless containerized application hosting platform within Azure, which is really nice to work with. And my cat, who's been sitting in front of me, is joining the call. And when you have a container app, you have that within a container apps environment. So if you have several applications that are all connected together, you can put those together in a container apps environment. And then the way we're deploying our container app is we're building the image, putting it on the Azure Container Registry. And then the important part that we're talking about here is really the AI services. So with this, we're deploying an Azure OpenAI service, and then we're deploying a model to that to be able to use within our chat-based system. And we're connecting to that through a managed identity. So it's all secured in the background. You don't need to pass around any authentication keys. And it's locked down so people external can't connect to it, which is cool. So in order to get this set up, they have some pretty good instructions on how to get it set up and working on your machine, and a few different options for you here. So the first two I wanted to talk about is they have an option for using GitHub Codespaces, which sets up a virtual developer environment for you in the cloud. So you don't have to have anything on your machine for this to work, which is really nice. So if you don't want to have to install all the tools or anything like that, you can still play around with this code base, deploy all of the services, take a look at the Bicep, do whatever you want to do, and it's all just in a web-based VS Code instance, which I think is pretty cool.
That's definitely my preferred option. I like to keep it simple, and Codespaces keeps it really simple from my perspective.
Yeah, especially if you're working with a whole bunch of different projects and they all have different requirements and different versions of tooling. Codespaces can really save you in that context.
Requirements have definitely been my downfall in so many scenarios where I've just overwritten stuff and updated stuff and all of that. Whereas Codespaces is so forgiving. Just every time I go to it, it's all nice and new again.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times for demos, it's probably a safer version to use as well, because it has everything defined for you, and you can set up any project that you want to be able to run in a code space. You have to define the tools that are required and all that kind of stuff, and Microsoft have some good documentation to tell you how to set it up in that way. The other option that we have here is in a VS Code dev container, and that's actually how I've set it up on my local machine. And that's because I just like working with the Visual Studio code that's on my machine. And what it's doing is it's setting up a local Docker container instance for you on your machine that everything is running in, that has, again, all the tooling and everything you need. So this project is using Python and a few different other things that are all installed in the dev container. And I've already set it up, but typically you would click this button, it would take a few minutes, and it would set up within your Visual Studio. We're now in my Visual Studio code dev container that I have on my machine, where I've set up that demo repo. I'm just starting in there's an infrastructure folder where they've put all of the infrastructure as code, in this case Bicep. I wanted to show you one of the simpler kind of resources to begin with before we go over to the AI side of things. So this is how they're declaring a log analytics resource. So there's a concept of resources which equate to your Azure resources. So in this case, it's a log analytics workspace that they're setting up. You do have to declare the API version and the template that you're using. So behind the scenes, this is how ARM knows what part of ARM resources that you're using. And then these properties are all the things that are required for that. And I have, there's a Bicep Visual Studio Code extension that you can get off of the marketplace that'll help us as we go through, that I'll talk about as we're going through. But it means that we can kind of highlight some of these things, and it'll give us some more information on what the requirements are and what it looks like there. And so some of the things you do have to know, for example, the types of SKUs that can go in with different type of resources. Those are often strings because of the way that ARM works behind the scenes. So you'll have to know, what the different string options are in that case, because usually it's only certain types that are going to be valid. But here we're declaring this resource in its own file, and we have parameters that are coming in. So these parameters can come from, say, a parameters file, or we'll be able to call this, it's called a module, from another location, and we can pass in these values. So it's very configurable in terms of the different things that you're able to pass in. And you can, make something like the SKU. That could obviously be a parameter as well that you change based on your different environments that you're deploying to.
And if you don't know any of that stuff, like you don't know what you need to fill in or you don't know what the format is, you could just ask Copilot that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So something like what the SKU is here, we could go in to Copilot. You can see I was asking some questions here before about the responsible AI policy names and the different options there. But we could also, let's start a new chat and say, let's ask about the SKUs for log analytics. And see what it says. So I have a GitHub Copilot license, and here you go. So it's giving me the options for what we can put in the SKU name, which is good because, like I said, it's not an open string. There's only certain options that you can use, but you can use tools like GitHub Copilot to be able to figure out what you can put in that place, which is nice.
Big time saver from having to go and look at the docs, and like every time I would come out of my code and go and look at the docs, it would be another 2 hours of my time because I'd get so distracted by other stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So we've declared the creation of this log analytics resource, how we want that set up, and the input and output parameters. And the way we actually call this is within our main Bicep, we are referencing it as what's called a module. So a module, you can reference modules that you have within your code base. So these are internal modules. So what we were just looking at before, where we said resource log analytics, that was a module that we've created within the code here. And now we're referencing it just by referencing the file location. Microsoft has also published a whole bunch of verified modules that you can use. So there's a whole public registry. And the point of modules is to do things like grouping resources together, sort of declaring a standard format for input and output parameters and different ways you may want to configure. Say, for example, you want to always have, every time you create a storage account, you want to save the endpoint into a key vault. If you way your business operates, you're always kind of doing these things together. You can group them together in a module. So it makes it really reusable within your business, and you can publish modules to an internal private registry that you can reference as well. And it's a really nice way to expand sort of the Bicep world to match how you like to set up your resources within your business, which is cool. And we're just passing in those required input parameters that we saw from the within the module itself here. Okay, so getting into the AI side of things, let's look into the cognitive services Bicep file. So I've actually removed a piece of code here so that we can write it together, and you can see how the IntelliSense with the Bicep extension and some of the GitHub Copilot stuff helps me out. The GitHub Copilot, if you can see, it's very light, is already sort of suggesting what I need to put here. But the way you declare that you want to deploy a resource is you always start with resource. And then the name that comes next, this is just a name, a variable type of name that you're giving to it. So it can be anything here. So I'm going to call it account. And then this part I find really nice. This is, it is the IntelliSense. It's telling me about all the different resources that I can now deploy. So there's a huge, this goes on and on, obviously, because there's a huge number of resource types. But it'll continue to autocomplete with suggestions in IntelliSense as you're going. So if you're not quite sure the naming conventions or how things are, this can help you with that. So Microsoft has kind of gone away from using cognitive services, and it's now generally AI services. But within the Bicep world, cognitive services is still the term used for all of the AI things.
Yeah, it's all the same, right? We just change the names every year or so just to keep people on their toes.
Yeah, exactly. So the terms that are used in, like the documentation and things like that are now AI service, but the technical stuff behind the scenes doesn't get updated as quickly. So it's still cognitive services. Yeah. But here we can see it's telling me about the different types of cognitive services things that I can deploy. And we want accounts. So an account is a type of cognitive services thing. So in our case, this will be an open AI is the kind that we're looking at. We could do things like text analytics, and there's a whole bunch of like the vision resources and that kind of stuff as well falls into that category. And then the other thing I like is after you do the you have to do which API version you're doing. So this is like the templating version, but it gives you a whole bunch of suggestions here, which means if you go into an existing code base and you're trying to uplift things, you can see, oh, hey, there's a newer version that I can use here. And that the IntelliSense will then use that version as you're writing to help you complete what you need to, which is nice. One thing you do have to be careful with, so I'm just going to do the tab to accept what Copilot is suggesting to me here. But there is, Copilot is actually a bit wrong in this case. So you can't blindly trust Copilot. In this case, it's saying the kind and the SKU should be under the properties tag, but really these two need to be one level up. But luckily my Bicep extension is smart enough to know that the kind property does not exist under properties. It should be one level higher. So having Copilot and Bicep extension working together, you can hopefully get the right result. It's, I guess, the lesson for working with AI in general. You don't want to just blindly accept what it's giving to you, because it's not always correct.
Well, I think that's the same as when you're working with people as well, right? Your colleagues aren't always correct either. You have to validate it. But yeah, it's good that it's making the suggestions and it's giving you some information about it so you can kind of figure out what's wrong when it's not working.
Yeah, exactly. So it does give you a good starting point. So we've filled in all the properties here that are required for deploying in this case, an AI service. These values for things like kind and SKU and all that, right now they're coming in as parameters. So here our parameter kind, we're defaulting it to OpenAI, and the SKUs will go to where that's defined. So right now we're calling this module, clicked on the wrong one, we're calling this module from within our main Bicep. We're having module and we're referencing that cognitive services Bicep, and we're passing in all of the details that are required here. Again, there's some pretty nice processing that is happening here within our Bicep code. So for example, there's an if statement. So this is part of that really configurable updates that have come with using Bicep versus ARM. You could do if statements and stuff before, but it was very tricky to do, whereas they made it a lot simpler now with Bicep. So you can pass in, you can have a parameter that says, yes, we want to create an OpenAI instance. This could be no if you have an existing one. In that case, you can pull up the existing one as part of your code as well. And then this is things like doing the naming and all that kind of stuff. Is it a certain parameter? That kind of stuff too. One thing that we should look at with this has been determined in this example here is the allowed locations for OpenAI in itself. So they have a list that they've kind of hard-coded into this, which thankfully does have quite a few locations. And for our location, I typically use Australia East because we're in Australia and there's quite a lot of model availability there. Obviously, there's a few others that are kind of around where we are, but I think Australia East is my favorite to use in this case.
I think I'm mostly using Southeast Asia, so the Singapore one, because I think they often get stuff just a little bit earlier than we do, and because they've been around a bit longer, and also they're quite a central hub for the Asia region. We're broadcasting across all of Asia for this episode, so I guess people should choose the data centers closest to where they are. Is that how they pick?
Yeah, so it depends on who you're creating this code for. Some businesses might have requirements for their data to live in a certain location. But obviously, if you're trying to use the OpenAI or any of the AI services, and we'll get into even the models as well, the availability of those things really differs depending on what location you're using. So that's one of the things that has really been a bit of a challenge, is making it so that it's flexible enough to be used in different locations where you're still getting a lot of the great models that you want to use and understanding what models are available. There is a link here in the code. Let's see, I'll open it here. So there's a link in the code that takes you to the OpenAI service model catalog. So this is just one of the ways to find out about what models actually are available. And it also shows you, you can scroll down and look through the different ones, but they have details on region availability for some of these models as well. So some of these newer ones, for example, O3 Mini is only available within East US2 and Sweden Central right now.
Yes, that's something I discovered during AI Tour, because obviously most of our advocates that set up all the demos and things were in the US, so they were using US. And when I tried to use our local region, all the newer stuff that we wanted to show off wasn't available yet. So I was using Sweden Central during that time. Nice, reliable data center there with lots of updated stuff.
Yeah, Sweden seems to be one of the ones that gets all the latest and greatest stuff. And luckily, some of the data centers closer to where we're located, for me and you in Australia, do get quite a few, but it's a little bit behind some of the US and Sweden ones. So depending on what you're building, if you're building something for yourself to play around with, or there's no sort of requirements on where that data is living or anything like that, you can use any of the data centers. But yeah, typically big enterprise, there's a lot of regulations and rules and concerns about latency and that kind of stuff if you're using a data center that might be in another country or far away from where your business is operating. But yeah, there's this models table that you can look at if you really want to. So we can see, for example, Australia East has these little green checkboxes. You can actually expand the table. But there's some of them. This is just really showing a small subset. There's a few of these tables for the different types of models. And yeah, as we're saying, like the US, like East US2, every box is green because they get all of those there. But there's quite a few availability spread around the world, which is nice. So if we go back to our code to talk about how these models are created in the code, in the Bicep, we can talk through that a bit more. So we're in the main Bicep here, and if we scroll down, when we're calling in the module for the OpenAI service creation, we are passing in this deployments array. And a deployment for an AI service is a deployment of a model. So the model, you have to describe what format it's going to be. So OpenAI, it could also be something like DeepSeek or another type of format in there. Or the different names as well. So the different names would be like our GPT-4 or GPT 3.5 or the mini, and those are the different model names. And then the version is important as well. So model versions are constantly, there's new versions coming out, and they're constantly retiring versions as well. But an important thing with the SKU, there's standard and global standard. There's some auto updates that happen around the global standard SKU for you there. And then we'll talk about some of these things in a bit more depth, but capacity is also important because that's based on the quota in tokens per minute that your instance might have. So as a personal user, my quota is quite small. So the example here, this is using a parameter. When you check out the repository, the parameters file, the capacity value here was 30. So the first time I went to deploy it, it completely failed because it's like, I think I had like five capacity and it was trying to do 30. So I changed it to 1 to work off there. So that's something you need to keep in mind if you're setting this up for yourself and we'll also take a look at how you can measure your quota. But to create the model, it's passing in those values, and then it's being used within the Cognitive Services Bicep module. So here we're doing the actual deployment, and because we're passing in an array of deployment models, we have a for loop here. So it's going to be able to loop through the array. So that's just another nice sort of thing that Bicep gives you. We do declare to do batch size 1 because Bicep tries to do everything in parallel as much as possible. But there are some issues if it tries to deploy 2 models at once to the same AI service. It doesn't like that. So you have to say, I want you to go through in a for loop, but just do 1 deployment at a time, which is fine. And then it's just passing in the required properties from there. So I have already run this, and I have everything up within the Azure portal. We can see I have my Azure OpenAI instance here, the container app. When you open up the container app, there's an application URL that opens it up, just a basic chat, and you can say, what is Microsoft New Breakpoint? It's a bit small. So if I zoom in, there you go. So I asked it, what's Microsoft New Breakpoint? It doesn't know.
It hasn't heard of us.
Yeah, it hasn't heard of us. I think maybe if I say, I can type, developer show, maybe it'll know what we're talking about here. But this is using that model deployment that we had. So we can tell that there's some sort of AI in the background that's looking this up and trying to figure out what Microsoft New Breakpoint is.
Oh, look, it found it. That's impressive.
Yeah, so it knows about the developer Microsoft New Breakpoint, if we call it a developer show, which is nice. So if we go back to our code, some of the parameters that were passed in, so I should mention with Bicep, you can have a parameter file. So this is really nice for, if you're trying to configure for different environments, say your dev, test, production environment, you can pass in the variables as within your parameters file. In this case, there's things around what model we're deploying. So the model that's deployed here is a GPT-4o mini. But say I want to deploy another model. Let's figure out how we can do a whole nother model deployment within our application. So the thing we were talking about before is about the model availability and what is actually available to us. So what we can do is we can look at that model catalog, but sometimes it might be hard to search through that. Another way to look for models that are available is via the command line. So I have my terminal here. I'm already logged into the Azure CLI. So I'm going to run a command that's on the Azure CLI using the cognitive services commands. So again, Microsoft has kind of moved away from using cognitive services and now generally uses AI services. But a lot of the technical tooling still uses the cognitive services naming. And here I'm going to say I want to list all the models in the Australia East location, because that's the location where my resources have been deployed. And I'm going to output that to a JSON file because it does give you a really big output. It's hard to read in the terminal. So if I run that, and then we're going to do, just open this in code. So nice thing in the command line as well is you can write code and then a name of a file, and it'll open it up in Visual Studio Code for you. And so we've opened up the JSON file that was spit out. And this tells us about the different types of models that are available in the location that we are using. So here's one just at the top that we can take as an example. Say maybe we want to add in some image processing to our application. Right now it's just that text processing where we can ask it questions. A model like the DALL-E model is really good for image processing. One thing to note in what's kind of given to you here is it doesn't actually tell you that, hey, this model is good for images. That type of thing. It does have image generation true, so it says that that is a capability, but again, you'll have to search through the models to figure that out. So in terms of knowing which models are good for different things, or if you want an all-rounder, you do have to still dig a little bit to try and figure out, okay, what models will be best in my scenario. But we know this DALL-E one we can add in, so we know we need name DALL-E 3. The important thing as well is also to look at the SKU name. So here we have SKU, and the name of that is standard. We'll need that in our configuration. And we'll also need the version number. So versions are often, new ones are coming out and then they're being retired. You can look at the model retirements in the catalog as well. But they also, in this object that's returned, they have a deprecation date for you as well. So this version is going to be retired just in a couple months. So even though this is one of the newer ones, it's, yeah, I guess it is a bit older, but the model cycle is actually quite short. So if you have a long living application, there's still some things you got to figure out on how to keep those models up to date. But let's add this one in. So I'm back at my main. So we're going to add in another deployment parameter, because this is another deployment object. This will be our next model. Its name, we want DALL-E E3. Model. Version, let's see, what is this giving me? The version we saw was 3.0. And this name, so this name here, model name, is the one that has to match. This name that you're giving it is just the name of the deployment so that you can reference it within your Azure deployment later. And then the other thing we need here is the SKU. We saw in the JSON objects that standard SKU is what's available to us. I'm going to leave it at capacity 1 because my user only has 1 capacity for that there.
I know how they feel. I feel like I only have 1 capacity too.
Yeah. And so now this is in the array, so in that for loop within the cognitive services resource deployment, it's going to deploy that model as well. So in my terminal here within my dev container, I'm going to, this is using the Azure Developer CLI, which is focused on deploying Azure resources, and I'm going to deploy the latest version. And while that's deploying, just out of interest, I always like to look at some of the model availability, what we get in other locations. So we can try that call again, say to East US, and see what we get.
Because these things seem like they're changing every single day, right? The models coming out, what's new. I watch TikTok, and all the time, every day, there's an announcement on there where they'll say, this new AI has made everything else obsolete. And it's just like, oh, how do you keep up? How do we keep up? But yeah, there's a lot available in Azure.
Yeah, there is a challenge with knowing which models are available, and it looks like actually I did get an error here, probably from when I was testing it out, that we were talking about with the quota limit. So this operation requires 1 new capacity in the quota capacity unit for Dolly, which is bigger than the current available capacity of 0. So this is a common problem that people have, and one way to look up your capacity is, there's a few different ways. You can do it through the CLI. The output is a bit difficult to look at. One way that's a bit more interactive that you can look at is through the Azure AI Foundry portal. So the Azure AI Foundry portal is a really is a tool to be able to interact and develop and test and do all the things with your Azure AI services. So I'm just going to look up my quota, and we can change what model we are deploying based on what we have there. One of the things that you can see within the Azure AI Foundry is there's this cool chat playground. So you don't even have to have, we have our Python app where you can do the chat-based system. Instead, you can just chat directly within the Foundry portal that we have here with your different models that you've deployed. But I wanted to look up the quota that I have. So we can see I've already used the Dolly, but we do have more capacity for GPT-3.5 Turbo. So maybe we'll change to using one of those models instead. But you can see
you can request that quota right there from within AI Foundry.
Yes, yeah. So you can request a quota upgrade. They do have limitations on the requests for personal accounts because they want to save the usage for big companies who are doing more big applications.
And it's not been instant either, which is annoying when you're trying to build stuff. If you request quota, you still have to wait for them to approve or deny it. So yeah, maybe switching to something else is better.
So let's maybe switch to another model.
I was going to say, while you were in there, Azure AI Foundry is the new name for Azure AI Studio, but it's not just Azure AI Studio. They've added more features and functionality in there and on top of that. So that's why they felt they needed to change the name to try and encompass all of the extra stuff that you can do in there. It's not just about being an AI studio. Yeah,
there's a whole bunch of tools you can see on the this sidebar here, there's things you can do with building different assistants and fine-tuning your models and managing your deployments and your quota. And even you can browse the model catalog from within the Foundry here as well. So it's another option to be able to see what models are available to you there.
Yeah, and you can get more information when you click on those or hover over them. So yeah, it's nice.
Yeah. So let's try and do GPT-3.5 Turbo instead, because I believe I saw I had more resources available there. Going to change this. We need to change the model name is really the important one. Make sure we have the right version and then the right SKU as well. So yeah, it's still standard for the SKU. And if we look down, version number here, 0613. Let's make sure we get that right. And then hopefully it should work. And while we're waiting on that, going back to the output of the models available in the US, some of the newer ones like those, let's see, DeepSeek, for example, you can use that. So formats, DeepSeek, and name DeepSeek R1, and there's some of those O3 mini ones. There's a whole bunch of different types of AI services in here that you might not have available to you if you're using another location. So especially if it's more sort of research or playing around, then hopefully you can do that. You can find a location that works for you. Has been deprecated. Okay, so here's the new error. Let's see. So this version has been deprecated. So it's interesting. It's coming up in the available models, but it's saying this is not one that we want to use. So we'll have to find another version. Here's another version here. Let's see, 1106. So this is really just a live demo of how it can be difficult to find versions and model numbers that actually work for you in this case. I did not plan this part out.
Yeah, I often get a lot of errors because, I'm not the best developer in the world, and I get really frustrated because it's not always clear to me what it's trying to tell me and what it's complaining about. But I'm a little bit happier these days because I will often just post those errors into Copilot and say, what does it want from me? And it will make suggestions about things I could do to fix that. So I'm less frustrated.
Yeah, and it looks like things are happier this time, which is nice. We can see that it's done in the terminal down here. It's done the 2 deployments of the 2 different models. So you could see I had a bit of back and forth where I was trying to play around with, okay, I know these models are available. Which one's actually going to work with my setup? And it's not a perfect solution. You can write scripts to be able to say call those endpoints and search through, but you still need to understand what models are going to work well for your application and understand how to manage the retirements and deprecation and making sure that's all kept up to date as well. So obviously there's the CLI tools that you can use, and there's the going through the things on the model catalog or the Foundry portal to look at, say, your quota usage or which models are available to you there, along with looking at which models are available to you. And this page, if we're back in the Microsoft documentation, they're talking to you about what models are being retired and when. So you can look into that to understand which model versions might be retired. So here's that GPT-3.5 Turbo. We're using It just was retired a couple of days ago, and very recently. So yeah.
Oh, well, that is good to know, because actually I have a workshop where I use 3.5 Turbo in it, so I guess I should deploy some newer models for that workshop.
Yeah, it's one that's been around for a little while, so it does. It is one that's been used quite a bit, but obviously they're wanting to keep everything up to date. But it looks like that everything deployed successfully. So what we can do to check the deployment to make sure things were deployed is a few different ways. We can look at the CLI again. I'll need the name of the Azure OpenAI service that was created. And if I open up my terminal, let me go here. So we're going to do Azure Cognitive Services account deploy list and name, and this is the name of the deployed OpenAI service, and then you have to do your resource group name, which was new BKPT AI demo RG, I believe.
Another thing I would use Copilot for, because I can never remember all of that. What do I need to tell it? Where do I need to look things up from?
Deploy. Oh, yeah. Okay, typo. So account deployment list. Yes. Yeah, so this is where you would want to have things written down. But we can see, so the output of that, so the Azure Cognitive Services account deployment list for this OpenAI service, we have the GPT-4o mini deployment that was initially there in the code. And if we scroll down, we have this GPT-3.5 Turbo one that we've just added in as well. And we can go back to the Foundry portal as well. And if we go to our deployments, we can see we're on our OpenAI service that we've deployed, and we can see our 2 deployments that have happened. You can look at the model versions that are here. It tells you a nice summary as well of like, hey, these are being retired in not too long from now, so that you can keep up to date with that. And there's different things when you click on it as well that you can look into a bit more details on what's happening with that model. You can see some metrics around the usage. We haven't actually used this one yet, so there's nothing there. There's some talking about some risks, so maybe it's detected some violations to your responsible AI or any sort of content filters if you have a chat system where you don't want people to be saying anything that's offensive or any sort of language that might not be accepted that you want to add in. You can add in a content filter to that as well.
I really do think that the safety and content filters are really, really, really good. I mean, you can also control stuff for responsible AI around the system and meta prompts that you put into your chats, but the safety and content filters are some really sophisticated stuff, and we do keep iterating and improving on those. So it's great to know that there are other ways that you can control your app on top of your system and meta prompts.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the configuration values that was in the Bicep code that we didn't use in this case, but if we go to the cognitive services, you can have the RAI policy name is the responsible AI policy, and then there's some ones that Microsoft have created for you, or you can create your own. So there's one called Microsoft.default that I tend to use. And I was asking Copilot earlier about the different responsible AI policy values that you could put here, and there was quite a long range of them, and things like anti-harassment and stuff like that. So you can look through the catalog to see, what kind of matches your business to have some of those things set up, in addition to some of the other sort of content filtering that you can do within your application. Yeah, you can also do things in here with, as I mentioned, the chat. So if you wanted to play around with the different models before you fully integrated it into your application, you can play around in here. If you, for example, initially we're looking at setting up an image generation focused model, we could go to the image playground and be able to interact with that here before we got it configured within our application to see, is that something that we really want to use. So there's a really good sort of amount of tools and things to play around with that you can do even just within the Azure AI Foundry itself as well.
Cool. And with the Bicep stuff that we have created there, is that stuff that you would then share with your team, or is it that you would just use that for your own deployments going forward?
So your infrastructure as code typically would be on a project system type of basis. Things like this cognitive services.bicep file that we have, where we have these input parameters, we're defining, there's some like networking rules that are defined, we're declaring the AI service resource deployment, and then doing the model deployments here. This is sort of a repeatable pattern that is configured because we're just passing in variables here for the actual, like the model names and those kind of stuff. So that's something that definitely should be shared. So these modules can be posted within a company's Bicep reusable modules, or they can be used throughout a project or a system. And anyone should be able to deploy it within either your CI/CD and your pipelines, whether you're using GitHub Action, or you can do the command line local deployment. So I'm using the Azure Developer CLI. You can also, in our case, main is really the main file that declares everything that we're deploying, including it does things like creating the resource group if you don't have it yet, that kind of thing. But you can also, within Visual Studio, do right-click deploy, and that'll deploy it to Azure for you. Some other things that are interesting within Visual Studio Code related to Bicep is you can do things like build your ARM template. So if you want to see the ARM template that's your Bicep will be transpiled into, and what Azure will actually end up reading to set up your resources, you can do that if you're interested. So this is the ARM template that was generated. I don't know if you can see on the side here, but it's very long. But things like where they were talking about the allowed values for the resource location, that's in here. If we go down quite a bit, here's where it's just declaring if you're doing your OpenAI deployment. You can see the linter is kind of getting confused with the JSON format. So this is one of the difficulties that people are having when they're working with ARM, is that you're trying to do things like variables and if statements and all in processing within the JSON format, and it's difficult to work with. So Bicep takes away from us having to do that and kind of puts it in the background, so you don't have to worry about it, and you have a nicer language to work with. But this is what it transpiles to in the background if you're interested. There's also there's also some nice tools. So if you have the Bicep extension installed, there's the Bicep visualizer. So we can open that up by clicking that button there, and I'll zoom in to see what we have. So this actually shows everything that you're going to be deploying based on what's declared in the project. Let's see if I can make it bigger. So we can zoom in a bit more and we can see things like here's our OpenAI deployments here. So we have our AI service account in our deployment that's connecting to where we have our container apps here. So there's this arrow going from the container app saying, hey, they're connecting into your AI. You can see details around, the role assignment is associated with the resource group. There's a log analytics workspace, and these things are actually interactive. You can move them around as you want. So it gives you kind of a nice starting point for an architecture just based on how you've declared your resources, because Bicep is really a statement of this is what I want my system to look like. So it's able to figure that out just from how you've set up your Bicep in the infrastructure as code, which is really cool.
I love that. All of that just from your little Bicep file.
Yeah, and obviously there's a bit more within this repository in terms of infrastructure than what we've talked about. So there's the container registry that the container app images are deployed to. There's setting up some security roles around how things are talking to each other. So if you're interested in more of, how that side of things is working behind the scenes, you can definitely dig into that. And then obviously the application itself as well is a Python-based chat application to be able to talk to the AI. So that's another layer that people can dig into by looking at the Azure sample that is available online.
No, I'm definitely going to do that after this. Looks great. Cool. Well, thank you, Melissa, for giving us the inside scoop on Bicep, and clearly it makes life a lot easier for anyone deploying AI services on Azure. But there were a few deployment bits there that it would be easy to come unstuck on, as we've seen, but it was really helpful for you to show us how you work around those, and we had a chance to learn from you rather than having to figure it out ourselves. So Bicep definitely becoming more prevalent, and it's a tool worth knowing. I know that during the episode you've mentioned a few resources online, which we're gonna share during this episode. Is there anything else you want to leave us with as your final words of wisdom?
I think probably just the big thing everyone's always talking about is AI going to take our jobs? And I think for us as developers, it's really something that we all need to get on board with using. It's not necessarily going to take our jobs, but I think you will be in a much better state if you adopt AI into your daily work life. So using things like GitHub Copilot and getting those tools that'll help you even just like brainstorm and answer questions and say, hey, I'm stuck in this spot, and being able to talk to it like a human, saying I'm getting this error from Azure, what's happening, can definitely really help you with that debugging process. So I think using AI in your day-to-day life as a developer is definitely like a very strong tool that we can all start using if you're not already.
Yeah, I think it's made me a lot faster, and it's made me a lot less frustrated, and it's fun. You can have a lot of fun building AI into your apps, and also that speeding up and that education part, when you build that into your apps as well, you're kind of helping the developers that come after you to have a better experience. Well, not just developers, everyone. But yeah, as you showed during some of your demos, it doesn't always give you the right information, but it points you in the right direction, and you can move on from there faster. And I think if you just let it replace you, it would probably be writing code that was a lot more bloated, because it doesn't really think of stuff from an architectural viewpoint for what your company wants. It just wants to give you everything that it can possibly think of to meet all the scenarios within there, and it needs the human touch alongside it. So partners together.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Well, we will list all those resources from this episode on our GitHub log. We're going to stick around for the next 10 minutes to answer any final questions that you have, so it's not too late to put those in chat. Thank you, Melissa, for joining us. Hope you've had as much fun as I'm sure our viewers have had, and we will see you all next month.
Thank you very much for having me.